Some people dream of fame and fortune, but all I ever wanted was a house in a quiet neighborhood and a minivan to haul my kids around in. I thought I was one of the lucky ones because I got everything I ever wanted. Right up until the day I was murdered. I always thought growing up in small-town Michigan was about as close to heaven as you could get.
We had a great childhood in Stevensville. Lisa liked to hang outside. We rode bikes all the time, and back then we didn't have the video games, and so we did a lot of outdoor stuff.
Sometimes I wish those days could have lasted forever. And as I got older, I wanted to find the same simple joys I felt as a small-town kid.
Lisa met Frank at work. They dated for a couple of years before she got pregnant. And it was just an instant, overwhelming motherly instinct for her.
Being a mother came so naturally to me. There's absolutely nothing I loved more.
I think being a mom meant everything to her. She loved him so much.
Lisa loved doing things with Jacob. Lisa's son was her world.
Then things changed. I always thought a child would bring a couple closer together. But for me and Frank, it seemed to do the opposite.
Lisa and Frank weren't getting along well. They were never together after Jake was born.
But I was determined to have a family. And before long, I let a new man into my life.
Lisa met Ron about 5 years after Jake was born. Ron had a son, Lisa had a son, and they all got along well. And they dated for a while before they got married.
Once I got married, I kept living the same kind of small-town, ordinary life that I had loved growing up. But I know now that horrible things can happen to ordinary people.
Berrien County 911.
I remember receiving a call on the morning of June 30th, 2000, of a missing persons report. Initially, the call seemed ordinary, like other missing persons calls. After arriving to the scene, it quickly became apparent that this was a very unusual call. Ron Fine told us that he arrived home from an overnight work shift and found that his wife, Lisa Fine, and children were missing from the house.
Lisa and Ron's sons were both very confused and frightened over what had occurred that evening. They stated they were woken up by what appeared to be people fighting, and one of the boys had gone down the hallway and observed a subject fighting with Lisa in the bedroom, and the subject had a full-face snowmobile helmet on as well as a black jacket.
They assumed it was Ron because they didn't know who else would be in the house overnight. They were both very scared and concerned.
I would have done anything to protect those boys. Thank goodness they escaped what I could not.
After a brief search of the residence, it was found that Lisa's glasses were still in her bedroom on the dresser, as well as her contacts. Ron stated that she would never go anywhere without them.
We did not find any signs of a robbery. We found money that was left on a dresser and other valuables that had not been disturbed. Also, her car was still in the driveway. We decided to check around outside the house. We noticed that there were some drag marks leading from a back door towards a wooded area.
At that point, the department called in all the resources that we have available to us to assist in a search of the surrounding areas.
Everyone that loved me wanted to believe I was out there somewhere, that I was still alive.
We began searching for Lisa. It's a very rural area out there. So we had a state police helicopter searching the area around the house. We had the reserve deputies organized, searching the fields around the house.
I was going to make sure everybody did everything they could. I was going to call the newspaper and put out flyers and get a search party together. I was going to find her.
It's hard to keep a secret in a small town, and nothing stays buried for long.
3 days later, a search was done by family friends. They discovered in a shallow grave what appeared to be the remains of a human.
During the autopsy, it was discovered that there was blunt force trauma to the head. The victim had died from suffocation. The remains were identified by a family member as being that of Lisa Fine.
I wasn't missing anymore. But for the people who loved me, a whole new reality was just starting to sink in.
I can remember it was dark when they came and told us. And my first reaction was to scream.
You picture that smiling person in your mind it's forever embedded. And you don't want to believe that they died a violent death, that she died fighting for her life.
Who murdered me was still a mystery, but to police, an obvious suspect surfaced soon enough.
During the initial investigation, you have to eliminate the people that are closest to the victim, such as the husband. It was discovered that there had been marital problems between Lisa and Ron.
Lisa's relationship with Ron wasn't always the best. She felt like their relationship was on a roller coaster.
Most of my life was pretty predictable, but my death was like nothing I could have ever imagined. I always felt safe in my little corner of the world. Life was calm and uncomplicated, just the way I liked it.
Lisa felt like Galeen was a good place to raise her child. She liked the fact that he could run and play. He was in the country.
Violent crimes in Galeen are very rare.
But Galeen, Michigan is like any other place. Things can turn dark at any given moment.
During the initial investigation, you have to eliminate the people that are closest to the victim. There had been marital problems between Lisa and Ron. These problems were mainly because of financial issues.
Lisa wasn't happy with her marriage right at that time. Lisa knew that there were big problems.
We sat down and talked to Ron as a possible suspect.
Ron's alibi was that he was at work the night and she was discovered missing.
Ron gave up his fingerprints. Ian took a blood test. So I think the next step is make a list of the names.
I can't blame police for taking a hard look at him. After all, Ron and I weren't seeing things eye to eye. But there are ways to prove you're telling the truth.
Ian took a polygraph test.
Ron did pass that polygraph.
Ron and I didn't always get along, but he was a man of his word.
His alibi was confirmed by various people who had been with him at various hours throughout the night.
I know the police did look at Ron as a suspect. I never once, for 1 second, thought Ron had anything to do with it.
Nobody could be absolutely eliminated, but we were pretty comfortable that Ron Fine's alibi was legitimate.
While investigators were no closer to finding my killer, one thing was clear.
Due to the nature of the crime, there was no signs of forced entry. It did not appear robbery or criminal sexual conduct was a factor, that Lisa was the intended target, and that it was more than likely someone that she did know.
In a small town like Galeen, everyone knows everybody, and one person's business is everyone's business.
During the course of the interviews with family and friends, it was discovered that Lisa had been, in fact, involved in an extramarital affair.
She didn't start out to have an affair, and she wasn't proud of it. I believe that she had an affair out of desperation.
This relationship lasted for about a month and had concluded approximately 6 to 7 months prior to her death.
I knew ending the affair was the right thing to do. After all, I was married. But saying goodbye isn't always so easy.
The phone records were checked at the Fine's residence, and it was verified that the person that she was having an affair with called Lisa the night before Lisa turned up missing.
I always knew my affair might come back to haunt me one day. I just never suspected it would haunt everyone else, too. Most people who met me assumed I was happy. Just another minivan mom living the idyllic small-town life. But things aren't always as they seem.
I was extremely surprised that she had had an affair. All I really knew was it lasted a few months, maybe 6 months, and they just decided to each go back to their spouses and work things out.
But some things have a way of haunting you, right up until the day you die.
While interviewing this individual, he indicated that the last time he had actually talked to Lisa was the night before her disappearance. Due to the recent contact, it did raise some suspicion.
When you're used to sneaking around, you typically have a good excuse for where you've been.
According to this individual, he went to South Bend on the evening prior. On his way home is when he stopped at a local payphone and returned the call to Lisa. After that, he went home and never left his residence. His alibi was verified, not only by the wife, but their children.
The subject was very cooperative. He voluntarily gave a DNA sample, voluntarily submitted to fingerprints. Without further evidence, we focused on other leads.
2 of the men in my life had been questioned about my death. But there was a third. And there was no denying our bond ran blood deep.
Frank Spagnola was the father of Lisa's son.
After Jake was born, Lisa had custody of Jake most of the time. They fought a lot about that.
Frank Spagnola and Lisa Fine had a very volatile relationship. There were constant custody battles as far as visitation.
Frank would violate some of his visitation rights, keep his son too long, not bring him home when he was supposed to from the visitation.
Frank was never willing to work with me to raise our son. And he wasn't about to work with police either.
When I interviewed Frank, Frank's alibi was that he had gone to a local video store that night and returned home. And he stated he never left his residence. After that, he basically quit cooperating with us.
Frank may have been done with the police, but they were still looking for something from him.
During the autopsy, fingernail clippings were taken from Lisa Fine, and those clippings were taken to the Michigan State Police Crime Lab where they were tested for any type of foreign DNA. Once the DNA profile was obtained, the previous samples of DNA from Ron Fine and the individual she had the affair with were submitted. And also at that time, a search warrant was obtained for the DNA of Frank Spagnola.
The stakes were high at that time, but it takes months to get DNA samples back from the crime lab.
It was very difficult waiting, but I stayed in contact with the detectives several times a week, making sure they didn't stop, but it was so hard.
I often searched in all the wrong places to find what I was looking for. But sometimes, if we're patient, the things we're looking for find us instead.
During the investigation, detectives located an inmate in California that was interviewed, and during his interview, he advised detectives that he was approached to kill Lisa Fine.
I can't say I knew anything about who this inmate was, but he sure seemed to know a lot about my life and my death. I'll never understand why some people have to hit rock bottom before they do the right thing.
Detectives located an inmate in California. During his interview, he advised detectives that he was approached by Frank Spagnola to kill Lisa Fine.
Maybe Frank wanted me dead because I was an inconvenience to him. But he talked to the wrong man. It turns out some bad guys draw the line when it comes to women and children.
The inmate advised that he was not willing to take part in that due to the fact that Lisa Fine had a son, and he did not want to take a mother away from her son.
I guess when Frank couldn't get someone else to do his dirty work, he decided to take matters into his own hands. And when the DNA results came back, investigators finally had the evidence they needed to prove it.
The DNA underneath Lisa Fine's fingernails was very huge to this case and was evidence that was directly linked to whoever attacked her. Both Ron Fine and the subject she had the affair with tested negative. However, Frank Spagnola was positive for a match to that DNA. Frank Spagnola was arrested and charged with first-degree murder of Lisa Fine.
Frank wanted our son all to himself, and he was willing to do whatever it took to make that happen.
It is believed that Frank Spagnola did go to the Fine home on the early morning hours of June 30th.
Frank entered the house, went upstairs to the bedroom, wearing a helmet to disguise himself, with the intention of harming Lisa, to get rid of Lisa.
He was the one who frightened the kids. Then he scared me right to death.
He did attack Lisa and killed her.
He then took her to a location where he buried her in a shallow grave.
Frank had gotten away with a lot over the years. I guess this time he thought he'd get away with murder.
Frank pled not guilty, which resulted in a trial which lasted 4 weeks. After the trial was conducted and all the information was presented, the jury returned a verdict of guilty of first-degree murder.
I guess if Frank couldn't have what he wanted, he was going to make sure nobody else did either.
I lost a friend, I lost a coworker, I lost a confidant.
His actions changed my family's life forever. Lisa's boy lost his mom, and now he was losing his dad. What I'd really like people to know about Lisa was she loved her little boy more than anything.
I always thought living in Michigan with my family was as close to heaven as I could ever get. I never imagined I'd get even closer. In a way, it's almost like going home again. Some people dream of fame and fortune, but all I ever wanted was a house in a quiet neighborhood and a minivan to haul my kids around in. I thought I was one of the lucky ones because I got everything I ever wanted. Right up until the day I was murdered. I always thought growing up in small-town Michigan was about as close to heaven as you could get.
We had a great childhood in Stevensville. Lisa liked to hang outside. We rode bikes all the time, and back then we didn't have the video games, and so we did a lot of outdoor stuff.
Sometimes I wish those days could have lasted forever. And as I got older, I wanted to find the same simple joys I felt as a small-town kid.
Lisa met Frank at work. They dated for a couple of years before she got pregnant. And it was just an instant, overwhelming motherly instinct for her.
Being a mother came so naturally to me. There's absolutely nothing I loved more.
I think being a mom meant everything to her. She loved him so much.
Lisa loved doing things with Jacob. Lisa's son was her world.
Then things changed. I always thought a child would bring a couple closer together. But for me and Frank, it seemed to do the opposite.
Lisa and Frank weren't getting along well. They were never together after Jake was born.
But I was determined to have a family. And before long, I let a new man into my life.
Lisa met Ron about 5 years after Jake was born. Ron had a son, Lisa had a son, and they all got along well. And they dated for a while before they got married.
Once I got married, I kept living the same kind of small-town, ordinary life that I had loved growing up. But I know now that horrible things can happen to ordinary people.
Berrien County 911.
I remember receiving a call in the morning of June 30th, 2000, of a missing persons report. Initially, the call